The images you're seeing are probably doing one of two things. One, they're either bringing back a slew of memories you had the pleasure of growing up with, or two, they're making you curious about a series you've probably heard about but haven't had the chance to sit down and watch just yet. You see, at the very heart of what makes the X-Men possible as a franchise is the struggle between the mutant race and the more traditional human race that the mutants are trying to fit in amongst. As the story goes, mutants are feared and hated for their special powers or abilities, and sometimes for their differing outward appearances. Fear of mutant kind forms the basis of the direct, day-to-day hardships for the characters we'll be talking about right here. And in the 1990s, we were treated to a timeless classic animated series that brought some of Marvel Comics' big-name mutants to the small screen for 5 memorable cartoon seasons. With all of that said, it's time once again for another Toy Connections retrospective, so stay tuned because this is the story of X-Men, the animated series. Let's begin. Like many superheroes, the origin of the X-Men dates back to the middle of the 20th century. Now, their history doesn't go quite as far back as Golden Age heroes like Superman or Batman, who first graced the pages in comic book form during the late 1930s. Nor does it go as far back as Captain America, who made his debut in 1941. The X-Men would make their comic book introduction during 1963. Right in the midst of what's become known as the Silver Age of comics, the X-Men we'd see there were familiar, yet still aesthetically different from what we'd come to know in the animated series during the latter part of the 20th century. That first Silver Age issue would see the introduction of names such as Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, Angel, Jean Grey, then known as Marvel Girl, and we'd also be introduced to the team mentor, Professor Xavier, who would be the head of the Mutant Academy at his X-Mansion, an institute that became a safe haven for mutants. Throughout the decades, we'd seen many members come and go, but for the purpose of this discussion, we'll narrow the focus to characters who were more prominent in the 1990s animated series. During the Bronze Age of comics, 1975's giant-sized X-Men #1 would further introduce us to Storm, as well as bring Wolverine into the fold after he first appeared in some issues of The Incredible Hulk during 1974. We'd also get some other first appearances of those who would become part-timers during the X-Men animated run, such as Colossus, as well as Nightcrawler, among others. We'd see Rogue make her comic appearance debut during the 1980s, and in the years leading up to the animated series, we'd also get the characters of Gambit, as well as Jubilee, thus completing the core cast that would feature in the Fox animated run from 1992 through to 1997. Yes, Marvel as a company would try their hand at various animation runs in the past, and classic and campy as those series were, it seems that X-Men the animated series would stand tall, becoming a more timeless, rewatchable show, thus establishing itself as a benchmark for what other comparable animated series could be measured against. But before we get to the main animated run, we should mention one earlier attempt at an X-Men cartoon, namely the one-shot episode titled Pride of the X-Men that aired in 1989, focusing on a young Kitty Pryde as she becomes inducted as a member of the X-Men. And while the single pilot episode did show some potential, it was never picked up for a longer series, though it did highly influence the Konami beat-em-up style X-Men arcade game of the early 90s. And more importantly, it showed us what an ongoing X-Men animated series could look like, thus somewhat laying the foundation for the ongoing series we did get from 1992 onwards. Of note, and in terms of greenlighting production of the series that we would get, Margaret Loesch, who was one of the executive producers for the Pride of the X-Men single episode, went on to become the head of Fox Children's Network. Seeing the potential that the one-shot special had, she ordered a full season of what would become X-Men, the animated series. This of course led to the ongoing run, production of which was largely handled by Saban Entertainment and Graz Entertainment. Saban, of course, would go on to produce the Power Rangers franchise from 1993 onwards. As for the animated series character aesthetics, a lot of this can be credited to Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's launch of what was then a new X-Men comic title in 1991, the first issue of which holds the record for the most copies ever sold at over 8 million issues. Jim Lee's costume redesign for some key heroes were the ones that made their way into the animated series, and for many, these designs are the ones that fans of the franchise associate most with these characters. While many characters would join the X-Men comic roster over the decades, it was a select group that formed the core team for the animated run. They'd be led on the field by Cyclops with his signature optic blast. He'd be flanked by Storm, the master of the weather elements. There'd be Jean Grey with her skills of telepathy and telekinesis, Gambit, a former thief turned hero, Rogue, along with her super strength and skin-to-skin absorption powers, Beast, the animalistic-looking researcher and scientist, Jubilee with her fireworks blasting energy, Wolverine, a natural loner with his iconic adamantium claws. And finally, the team mentor, Professor Charles Xavier, the well-known telepathic mind reader, also capable of mind control. The initial roster would also include Morph, the shapeshifter who started out as an X-Man, but would have a tumultuous relationship with the team throughout the series, albeit he would reconcile with the team by the animated run's conclusion. Morph's abandonment in Season 1's opening episodes became a point of contention among team members as the series progressed. Though as we discuss this series, it's also worth looking at what else was going on entertainment-wise as X-Men was in the midst of getting popular on television. The Saturday morning cartoon lineup of the 80s had shifted, now with the rise in prominence of popular franchises like the comparable Batman the Animated Series, another superhero show of which future cartoons would be measured against. The television landscape was shifting as the world became more accepting of risque levels of programming. Overall entertainment standards were leveling up with the use of special effects and more high-end cinematography techniques. And society as a whole was being exposed to more rebellious levels of influential media, as conventional music made way for the grunge music culture that would dominate for the majority of the 1990s. All of this represented the entertainment scene that X-Men the Animated Series was being ingrained into. And it fit right in, what with the more mature overtones and storylines by comparison to other, more innocent Saturday morning cartoons. X-Men the Animated Series was key in terms of making sure the audience was compelled with ongoing, overarching storylines. Over the duration of its 5 seasons, you deal with things such as the love triangle between Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Wolverine. There'd be complicated inter-team dynamics such as that of the aforementioned Cyclops and Wolverine right from the opening episodes due to Cyclops' decision to leave Beast and Morph behind on the initial mission to save the rest of the team, much to Wolverine's dismay. We'd be subject to Wolverine's inner struggles, what with an on-again, off-again display of anti-hero characteristics and his incredible rivalry with Sabretooth. We'd see familial conflicts such as that of Charles Xavier's rocky relationship with his brother Kane, who of course is the Juggernaut. We'd see the ongoing struggle throughout Season 1 with Beast being imprisoned for most of the opening season's worth of episodes, but eventually being freed and rejoining the team for the rest of the animated run. Jubilee would be at odds with herself in trying to fit in with the team, and Rogue would have her own inner battles, trying to control her touch absorption powers. And all throughout, you'd see selective appearances of comic favorites such as the time-traveling Bishop from a few decades in the future, and the time-traveling Cable from the distant future, as well as the ever-so-powerful Colossus. There's Vindicator from Alpha Flight with his past history with Wolverine, and you'd also see Nightcrawler, Archangel, along with many others. And of course, there were the more signature villains such as Mr. Sinister, as well as Apocalypse, who was the epitome of evil itself, and the more relatable Master of Magnetism, Magneto, who as many know was an old friend of Charles Xavier's. We also had the giant robots called the Sentinels, who were specifically sent out to hunt down mutants. And that's not even counting several other villains who would pop up throughout the course of this extended run of episodes. And while the eclectic and dynamic cast of characters is already more than enough to make the series memorable, the multi-part story arcs themselves do a lot to enhance the legacy of the X-Men brand. There'd be several tales adapted directly from the comics, for example, the sacrifice made by Jean Grey when she came in contact with the Cosmic Phoenix Force, seemingly costing her her life, and the follow-up Dark Phoenix saga that had viewers on the edge of their seats as the miniseries concluded. All of this, of course, would put them at odds with the powerful Shi'ar Empire. This comic series was iconic enough as it was during the Chris Claremont and John Byrne run of Uncanny X-Men from the late 1970s through to 1980, and the animated series continued to add to its immortal status. There's the equally memorable Days of Future Past, where a dystopian future is shown as a result of an assassination that occurred decades earlier. In the comics, it's Kitty Pryde who travels to the past to thwart the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly. But in the two-part animated episode, it's Bishop who takes the place of Kitty in his own attempt to stop the similar assassination plot. Of course, all of this set up the groundwork for the 2014 Days of Future Past film, for which Wolverine is the one sent back in time. The series would also adapt the early issues of the 1991 X-Men comic run into the two-parter known as Sanctuary, whereby Magneto creates a peaceful place for mutants to live aboard his new safe haven known as Asteroid M. These are but a few of many story arcs that made the animated run such a classic. Now, if you've seen the series before but never got a chance to finish, or if you're a first-time viewer, it's worth pointing out that the animation does take a bit of a dip during Season 5, and that's because the series was really only planned to be 4 seasons long. The series was supposed to end after the epic 4-part miniseries called Beyond Good and Evil, where the X-Men finally defeat Apocalypse, and then Fox Network decided to order a 5th season. That being said, some budgets were cut, while some animation staff had moved on to other projects, and thus the final season doesn't aesthetically look as deep or as polished by contrast to previous seasons. Still, it's part of the story and is still worth a watch to complete the tale. Note that the positive reception of the animated series was key in the interest and eventual development of the live-action movie anthology series, also done by 20th Century Fox. Who knows if we'd ever have gotten to see Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen, or many other icons grace the big screen for years and years if the animated series hadn't done its part to bring the X-Men to the forefront of pop culture consciousness. In general, many would say that X-Men the Animated Series has aged well. Some would say there's still a few cheesy elements that didn't age quite as well, but overall, it's more good than bad. Its mature storytelling was ahead of its time during the 1990s, and while there are a few throwaway episodes, the multi-part specials and grittier, darker tone of the series allow it to be appreciated to its fullest, even decades later. And hey, who could ever forget that iconic theme song? That said, by comparison, some would still claim that X-Men as an animated series would fall second in terms of top status to Batman the Animated Series. This series was itself a similarly dark-toned cartoon that had aged up along with its audience, having taken some cues from the Tim Burton Batman films, and featuring the timeless voice of Kevin Conroy for countless episodes as well as some animated movies. You could also consider the X-Men animated run as something of a companion show to Spider-Man the Animated Series, which itself ran for 5 seasons beginning in 1994, also on the Fox Kids network. With both franchises owned by Marvel and having the backing of Fox, it made crossovers possible, so it did create an interesting dynamic to see the X-Men show up in a Spider-Man cartoon. And with X-Men 97 picking up from the events where the 90s animated run left off, the legacy of the animated franchise has been made an even bigger standout amongst Marvel's stable of iconic must-watch media offerings.
To me, my X-Men.
Thus, when you mention the X-Men, many people will immediately think of a franchise that captivated the hearts of multiple generations. People who were kids that grew up with the original comics of the 60s could see their own kids watch the animated run of the 90s, and those same people, along with the follow-up generation thereafter, could enjoy the selection of movies that would permeate for years and years after. It's safe to say, the X-Men isn't one of those franchises that had a single high watermark and then fizzled out after just a few short years. If anything, the X-Men have had multiple high watermarks, crossing all forms of media and entertainment, with the 1990s animated series being core among them. It's a testament to its legacy that it was picked up again for a follow-up, continued animation run over a quarter of a century later. Certainly, some of the story arcs mentioned here, and even some of the ones that weren't mentioned, are worthy of their own deep dive discussions among your friends, be it in person, or in more podcast-style live discussions, or in select videos such as these ones. But this was just a general overview of what you may have missed if you haven't seen this animated series before. And for those of you who have seen it before, hopefully this stroll down memory lane was worth your time and brought back some wonderful recollections of the past. The X-Men are a natural collectability choice for those looking to buy toys and other merchandise. They're also an expected choice for fans to cosplay as its various characters at fan conventions. And they're an evergreen franchise for new fans in new generations to pick up an old comic book and flip through the pages to see how the story has evolved over the decades. From its humble beginnings as a small team during a Silver Age, to its time-tested stories of the Bronze Age and beyond, to its live-action and animation runs, few superhero teams are as popular and make for as much must-see or must-read media as the X-Men. So let us know in the comments section below what your favorite X-Men animated series memory was. Also, let us know where your X-Men journey takes you next, be it as a revisitation of the comics, a rewatch of a classic movie, or another trip to your television to experience the animated series, be it as a first time or as a repeat viewer. Or if your next stop is to watch the follow-up X-Men 97 series, tell us about that as well. And if you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm going to put another cartoon retrospective which you can click on right over here, or for an altogether different television series retrospective, you can click right over here. And with that, I'll see you all next time. Thanks again, and take care.